Hello, welcome to Lecture 2, an abridged history of Indigenous misrepresentations and cultural appropriation. So in this lecture, we will be drawing from the themes of Lecture 1, wherein we discussed how modes of coloniality in the Americas were assisted by rhetorics of racism and misogyny, and how these implanted themselves on Indigenous folks such as Indigenous women or Indigenous queer and trans folks, who had very negative representations of them perpetuated in non-Indigenous aesthetics and media. And what these narratives and rhetorics did were normalized forms of colonial violence and processes of ongoing settler colonialism. So today we're actually going to delve into some of the stereotypes that did emerge during this time and how we can connect these stereotypes to contemporary forms of racism and misogyny that Indigenous peoples contend with today. The first trope that emerges for modes of coloniality in the Americas is the Indian maiden. She is also known as the Indian princess. The term princess derives from common lore that these figures are often the daughters of historical chiefs. One such example is Pocahontas, who was a child when she met English explorer John Smith. In Pocahontas's case, we now know the story that John Smith told about her saving him against the wrath of her father is not true. Such narratives show how the figure of the Indian maiden was used by would-be colonists and settlers to rationalize their colonial projects in the Americas. The representation of the Indian maiden is one that is always passive. She is seductively dressed, and she's willing to go out of her way to assist the white men she encounters. The Indian maiden is a virtue signal to white settlers who impose their own identities on John Smith. White settlers tell themselves, we would have acted differently, or our communities would have acted differently. We would have been like John Smith and made relationships with Indigenous peoples at the onset of colonialism. Yet, the figure of Pocahontas is mobilized by white liberal figures like John Smith in his story, and she's often sexualized or at best exploited if you consider that Pocahontas was eventually brought to Europe against her will and died there away from her home and community. The representation of the Indian maiden is one that naturalizes and even invites the presence of early colonists into America and ongoing processes of colonialism. There is another troubling figure in this dichotomy that we do need to discuss, and it's one that adds a layer of complexity in the gender analysis of these early figures and heroines of settler colonial rhetoric. We know her by a problematic term that I would never advise anyone outside of this course to use, but as a mode of analysis, we do need to call her what she has been called throughout history, and that is the squaw. So the squaw is always positioned as the antithesis to the Indian princess. Her proportions are displayed as grotesque. Her facial features are that of a man. She has a wide-set build, often like a man. And there is emerging theory at the intersections of Indigenous studies and trans scholarship to consider whether these narratives were representations, perhaps, of trans people at times. Certainly, we can also see this perhaps being associated with the need to dissolve the importance of Indigenous women within Indigenous communities because they were such forces of governance, especially when they would become cultural leaders as elders. In comparison, we see the Indian maiden who is always youthful. Indigenous women in the colonial ideology, somehow they lose their importance after they age out of this nubile and sexualized perspective of the white man. Now, in contrast, what's interesting is the white woman is depicted often in this binary as the white woman is represented somewhere within this mess of dichotomies as a punishing force to both the squaw and the Indian maiden. Her virtuistic sexuality and modesty is revered in comparison to the Indian maiden, and also the so-called patriarchal ways of the Indians are something that her brand of liberal feminism is against, but also simultaneously needs to be protected from. It's a very heady mix of white supremacy and misogyny. The next figure we want to talk about is the invisible queer. And this is quite an elusive figure because we don't actually have a representation of this figure. What characterizes the invisible queer is their non-existence. We can look back at a history of Western media and see that there has been little to no representation of Indigenous gender variants, also of Indigenous gay, lesbian, queer, or trans peoples, or even two-spirit peoples. Those representations that have been captured in media anyways, they tend to be very derelict depictions of urban Indigenous peoples who have been forced into survival sex work, peoples who have been pushed out of their communities and really are struggling with the oppressions of poverty and having to live in the city away from their communities. We seldom see a very positive narrative about queer and trans people in Indigenous media. This isn't to say that Indigenous, queer, trans, and two-spirit peoples don't exist. Of course they do exist, and there's been a long history of their activism in movements such as the gay and lesbian Indian movement, and then in later years, around the 90s, the commencement of the two-spirit movement, and even now in a more expansive understanding of these identities such as Indigenous trans activism or Indigenous queer activism. Folks are even looking to their Indigenous languages to find sort of meanings to name these gender variances that they're experiencing and how they fit into roles within their own communities and languages and knowledge systems. But because these representations haven't existed in media, this does mean that often people who do want to seek out these representations of Indigenous queer, trans, and two-spirit peoples are at a loss for finding positive representations that don't just fall prey to the same sort of stereotypes that people think about city Indigenous folks. Because right now, in the discussion of queer and trans Indigenous folks in the academy and in the discipline of Native studies, often these peoples are reductively associated with the idea of city Indians. So something other than reservation Indians or Indians that live remotely and fulfill the idea of what we think to represent Indigenous peoples. In this course specifically, we will be discussing queer coding and how prior to recently, Indigenous peoples had to look to media and sort of read into certain inferences and hopefully find sort of coded representations of queer, trans, and two-spirit Indigenous peoples. But even this is quite hairy and problematic because even those communities of Indigenous cultural practitioners might not want their work to be read as such because of, well, deep misogyny and deep homophobia and transphobia in Indigenous communities. Coming back to representations of the Indian maiden and the squaw, these stereotypes continue to manifest in how settlers have a continued fascination with the idea of playing Indian. The Indian maiden pops up in every decade following colonization, and her form and context is always shifting. The one thing that does stay the same is her inherent sexualization. She's always scantily clad and ready to be conquered, perhaps sexually, by the white men who gaze upon her. And this emerged very interestingly around the 1970s in cohesion with hippie culture. So the rhetorics of wanting to return back to the land and undo capitalism again became tied to this misogynist notion of indigenizing oneself through sexual relations with Indigenous women. Of course, these kinds of narratives have very deep ramifications. They pop up in very racist stereotypes, such as the Redskins. There are Indigenous peoples who had high school teams when they were growing up that were titled the Redskins. And these were the formations or the understandings that they had about race and themselves from an early age. We can see it in perhaps less overt or overtly harmful manifestations, such as young women who wear headdresses to Coachella. But even though this seems like a harmless act, it's still the notion of appropriating Indigenous iconography and representing Indigenous peoples as dead or dying, and their cultural objects as something that we wear to celebrate our continuance as a nation state and a peoples over the graves of the Indigenous peoples we decimated. It gets even more complex when we think about the idea of the Indian maiden and the squaw in the context of legal jurisdictions such as Canada's Indian Act. The Indian Act was a document that was devised to slowly end the Indigenous communities through the bloodlines of Indigenous women. So, for instance, Indigenous women who married out of their communities until an amendment was passed on the Indian Act in the 1980s, they would lose their status as Indigenous peoples. White women who married into Indigenous communities during that time then were afforded Indigenous status. Children of women who married out, or the children of women who had those children with non-Native men, then were also classified as a subclass under the Indian Act, and they are not able to now bear Indigenous children who would be recognized under Canada's Indian Act as Indigenous peoples. So this was a direct targeting of Indigenous women to slowly decimate Indigenous peoplehood within Canada. As we can plainly see, the settler colonial project in Canada has been contingent on actually intervening on the lives, reproductive lives, family lives of Indigenous women. So it's not too far of a stretch to then connect the appropriation of Indigenous identity and race shifting to forms of misogyny. Ancestry and the Indian princess is a mystique that seems to pop up in a lot of the rhetorics of individuals who claim Indigenous identity falsely. So one example is the emergence of false Métis communities in Eastern Canada, such as the Eastern Métis, who are not recognized by Indigenous organizations such as the Manitoba Métis Federation. Often the rhetorics of these peoples will reference a single ancestor way back in their genealogies, much farther past 5, 6, 7 generations. Maybe they are from the 1500s or the 1600s. And interestingly, this figure is more often than not an Indigenous long-lost grandmother, a Cree woman, a lone feminine figure that gives that family line some form of access to Indigenous identity, at least in their mind. The significance of the practice of race shifting being inherently associated with this idea of a long-lost grandmother many generations back who is Indigenous is the inherent misogyny that is associated with race shifting. These settlers and these settler families who are falsely claiming Indigenous identity, and perhaps to appropriate Indigenous aesthetics or to monetarily benefit from the dissemination of Indigenous identity, they're reiterating the rhetorics of early settlements that their white ancestors naturalized within their own communities at the time. This brings up a larger issue of cultural management. Who is allowed to represent us as Indigenous peoples? What does it do to our cultural stories when they are appropriated or misrepresented? Do Indigenous peoples have a responsibility to protect their stories from appropriation and misogynist inference in creative industries? These are all questions that I hope that we can answer during this section of our seminar.